Hey everyone, sorry for the slightly late start here. I was having some issues with Riverside. Hopefully it's now working. I'm trying to wait for some confirmation from the team. Seems like we now are live. So yeah, once again, sorry about that. It took a little bit of back and forth to get things up and running, but we are now good to go. So normally at this point I would say I'll give everyone a few minutes to join, but given we started a little bit late, I think we should just crack on. So welcome everyone, I am Craig Bradford, COO of SearchPilot, and today we're going to be running through this webinar on how to set good targets and increase your chances of actually hitting those targets. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I'd love to know where everyone's from, and also feel free to ask questions. There will be time, hopefully, at the end to answer some of those. So let's get into it. One thing just to mention, this is going to be recorded and we will be sending out the slides and the recording probably tomorrow. So yeah, hopefully keep an eye out for that email. Right, let's get started. So we're also going to be, if you're on this webinar right now, you're going to be entered into the prize draw to get a pair of Apple AirPods. We'll do that afterwards once we check the attendees, and then we'll send out the winner probably tomorrow or the day after as well. Okay, so this webinar was actually inspired by a recent story that happened a couple of weeks ago, but actually it's one that I have had many times, which is I chat to an in-house SEO team, ask them how things are going, and they say, not too good actually. We're down 30% year-over-year traffic. I then ask them what the cause is, they don't know, and then I ask them what the goal is for this year, and the number one answer is usually, we've set targets to get back to where we were before. And while I admire that drive and determination, sadly, it's not realistic, right? If you have had a 30% decrease in traffic, not only do you have to get back that 30%, you actually need to grow more than 30% to get back to where you were. If you've had a 30% drop in traffic, you actually need a 43% increase in traffic just to get back to where you were. And so sadly, this is a lot of times the default response people have when the traffic is going down. And while it's understandable, it's not realistic. And so that's what we are here to talk about today. It is balancing this challenge of ambition with realism. How do you set targets which are both motivational but also grounded in reality? So we're going to cover this in 4 sections. We're going to start off by talking a little bit about benchmarking, how you do that. We're then going to talk about picking targets. We'll move on to tracking against your goals, and then we hopefully will have time at the end for Q&A. The invite, by the way, I should say, says we're going to run about an hour. I highly doubt that. I think it's probably going to be more like 35, 40 minutes. So it's definitely worth your while to stay to the end to be entered into the chance of getting those AirPods. Okay, let's get into it. So benchmarking, how do you do it? There are 3 areas that I recommend people start with. Firstly is your own analytics. You also want to check the macro environment, and then you want to look at comparisons and competitors as well. And we're going to touch on each of these right now. So when it comes to benchmarking, when people say the traffic is down 20% or 30%, whatever that number is, that alone isn't very useful. You have to be able to unbundle that and say which parts of your website are up and down. And then that can inform your strategy. So these numbers are all made up, by the way, and all of the numbers that you'll see today are made up unless I say otherwise. You see at the top here, this site is down 20%, but within that I've broken out all the various categories, right? So the the shoes section, for instance, is actually up 16%, but the beauty section is down 10%. And so that's really step one. You have to unbundle that 20% and find out where are the areas of the website that you need to defend, and just keep doing what you're doing there. Make sure that you don't roll out anything that accidentally hurts your traffic. And then the other areas where you're struggling, like beauty or the men's section, you're going to have a different approach to growing that traffic and try to recover some of the loss. But you need to look at it as a granular level as you possibly can. The second thing that's worth mentioning is the macro environment. I saw this post a couple of weeks ago from Eric, who showed that the B2B review space right now is really struggling. Sites like G2 and Capterra are down sometimes 80, 90% in organic traffic. And if you're in a market like that, it's really important that you recognize it, because as much as you might have determination and you want to get back that traffic, it's not realistic to say, well, we're going to get back 80% or 90% traffic in a year. And it's definitely worthwhile knowing what macro and external factors could be impacting your success. It's not just how hard you're trying. It's good to know whether it's a you problem or whether it's a bigger problem than that. So that's definitely worth checking before you set off to set any goals. And then the last area is comparisons and competitors. So one of the things that can be really challenging is to look at the rest of the market and understand where you sit within that space, and understand what chance you have to recover some of that traffic. Take, for instance, Macy's as an example. They sell lots and lots of different products across lots and lots of different categories. So who would you say are Macy's competitors? Well, it really depends, because if you use tools like Ahrefs or Moz, they will give you an answer like this, where they'll say companies like Ralph Lauren or Coach or Nordstrom and H&M, lots and lots of different brands. But what you quickly realize is within that, there are many different ways that you can sort of categorize your competitors. You could look at, for instance, location. Are these online only brands, or do they do online and offline? Someone like Macy's and Nordstrom do both, whereas ASOS only do online. You could look at the brand. Is this a single brand company like Ralph Lauren, Coach, Crocs, or is it a company like Macy's, Nordstrom and ASOS who sell lots and lots of different brands? And then lastly, you've got the competition type. Is this a company that is across multiple categories? Are they on a single category like fashion or electronics? Or are they even more specialized, and are they a niche specialist like Crocs, who not only do they only specialize in fashion, but they actually only specialize in shoes? So when you look at it like this, it gives you a different lens to consider who your competitors really are. And this is just another way of visualizing that. If you were to look at each of your verticals, you'll notice some trends. Excuse me, give me 1 second just to get a drink. So if we look at beauty, there are companies in there like Chanel, Clinique, Sephora, and Nordstrom. But as you go across the categories, you'll notice that companies like Nordstrom are across all of these different verticals, so they are horizontal competitors, whereas something like Chanel or Dyson only show up in a single category. And that's really important for doing your benchmarking, because you want to know who you're competing with, what resources they have, and what breadth and depth they are competing in. This is a great blog post by Tom Critchlow that I recommend reading. It's called Managing Expectations by Finding Good Comparisons. That talks through this process of how do you try and benchmark and forecast how much traffic you might get if you put a particular initiative in place and if you invest in something. So the reason why this is about comparisons and not just competitors is sometimes there may not be a competitor. The example Tom gives is a company I believe it's a pet website, who decides to also get into pet insurance. Their traditional competitors aren't in that space, and so they can't just go and look at how they've managed to do it. So instead, what you need to do is go find other websites which are of a similar size, similar revenue, similar number of staff, and try and get a sense of, okay, is this the type of results that we can expect? And how much would we need to spend in order to get similar results? And over what sort of period might that take? And so highly recommend this. It's a great resource to help you out when you're doing these sort of investment plans. But let's go through a real example with some data. And when I say real example, this is real data from Ahrefs. It's not that Macy's are a customer of SearchPilot, just to make that clear. So the data I've got here is for one section of Macy's, which is for their makeup and perfume section. And as you can see, their traffic has decreased from around 280,000 sessions to 148,000 sessions. And the reason I've used January as the endpoint here is I took these screenshots early February, and so it wasn't a complete month yet. So that's why it's not quite 2 years, but it's almost a 2-year period. So that's what we're looking at. What that means is that is an annualized decline of almost 30% for this section of their site, which is a big drop, obviously. If we compare that to how other more vertical specialists are getting on, if we look at someone like Clinique, over the same time period, their traffic has actually increased significantly. This is an annualized increase of almost 40% year over year. Similarly, if we were to look at Sephora, they've also increased from around 5.8 to 6.8 million, which is around about a 9% annualized increase. So 3 different companies, 2 vertical specialists. One is Macy's, who is across multiple categories. And so why are we looking at this? Well, the reason I like to do this is it gives you a sense of what can you expect in terms of growth rates if you are not a specialist. So we know that companies like Sephora and Clinique, they are specializing just in beauty, whereas someone like Macy's or any other retailer who's going across multiple categories, they don't have the same level of resources and focus on a single sector. And so that can act as sort of an upper and lower boundary for what you can expect in terms of growth rates. I like to talk about this quote from Gerald Weinberg, who talks about the law of strawberry jam, who says, the more you spread it, the thinner it gets. And that's exactly what you see with big retailers like Macy's or anyone else who's trying to go across multiple categories. It's not realistic to try and get the same level of growth as the top performers in those vertical specialists, because you are spreading your resources across multiple areas, and it's going to get thinner and thinner the more you do that. And so that's why I like to look at not just horizontal competitors, but vertical competitors, because it gives you an extra sort of dimension to look at what is the upper and lower bounds of that. So now that we've done that sort of benchmarking exercise, the next stage is to try and set your actual targets and pinpoint what you want to aim for. But before we get to that, I just want to take 5 seconds of your time to quickly introduce you to SearchPilot if you're not familiar, and also offer you something that I think is really exciting. So SearchPilot, what we do is we work with some of the biggest companies in the world to run their SEO testing program. You can see some of the logos we work with there, companies like Petco, M&S, Skyscanner, and many, many more. And what that allows us to do is prove the value of the changes that these companies are making from an SEO perspective and connect revenue to traffic. And so what we do when we initially start working with customers is we offer these Discovery Day programs where we will come in and talk with your SEO team. Sometimes we bring in product teams as well, and we will do a deep dive on what an experimentation program could look like for your company. And if you would like to book one of these sessions, you can do a few things. You can either click on the link which is on screen right now. You can visit the bit.ly link, or you can scan the QR code. But the idea here would be, if you're a large retailer who wants to get a testing program up and off the ground and you're not doing it at the moment, we use this framework of an SEO testing maturity model. And we would come in, we'd work with you to figure out what stage of this SEO testing maturity curve you're at. We would cover a lot of the SEO testing foundations. We would share relevant insights to your industry and share tests that we've seen be positive in the past. We'd also talk about how you can integrate that with existing testing programs. Often the companies that we work with have a user testing program already, and it's important that we can connect up with that and make sure that we are integrated. And then finally, you would leave that session with an actionable roadmap that you can have a clear set of next steps to understand what you need to do to move up that maturity curve. So if you're interested in doing one of these sessions, it's completely free with either myself or Will Critchlow, the CEO of SearchPilot. Click on the link and we will book you in for an initial 30-minute discussion where we will talk about what that could look like and whether or not it is relevant to you. Okay, so that being said, let's now get into how we set the actual targets. So the first thing to mention is we need to talk about depreciation for a second. If anyone saw this webinar from Will, you will know what I'm about to talk about. If you've not, I recommend watching it or reading the blog post. But essentially, the issue is that a lot of people, by default, assume that if you grew, say, 10%, 20% last year, when you go to make your plans for this year, you sort of just assume that that is going to happen. And we would argue that that is not true. And I think as an in-house SEO person, you should also argue that it is not true, because if, for instance, you take paid channels, if you were to turn off your paid channels tomorrow, your traffic would obviously immediately drop off. But that wouldn't happen with organic traffic, right? If you just somehow get rid of your whole SEO team tomorrow, your traffic wouldn't suddenly drop off a cliff. It would take time, but it would decline over time. And so there is an aspect of depreciation. And so it's important that when you are calculating the ROI from your testing program, that you don't just look at your year-over-year performance, because that is going to undersell the total value of the gains that you have accumulated over that period. So we look at this image from Will here. This sort of explains it quite clearly, where in the red you have this estimated depreciation factor. The dotted line is the gains that you've probably made that year, but ultimately this green line is what your year-over-year performance looks like, right? And maybe that's up, say, 10%, but actually your true ROI should take into account this depreciation as well, because that is what you've had to still maintain this year. You don't just get that traffic for free. You have to beat your competitors who are constantly trying to copy you and try things and outrank you. And so highly recommend taking a look at the full presentation by Will, who goes into this in a bit more detail and shares some real data, real case studies that will explain this a lot more. But what we have at this point is an idea of your historical performance by category. You've hopefully done some benchmarking of your horizontal and your vertical competitors, and you've now estimated some sort of depreciation factor that might be taken into account as well for your testing program or your SEO program. So next is to try and turn that into tangible results. So this is where the framework of C90, C60 and C10 comes into play. And this is actually taken from SaaStr by a guy called Jason Lemkin, who uses this as a financial modeling plan, but I've adapted it for SEO purposes. And I really love it because it allows you to set both stretch targets while also being realistic at the same time. So let me just explain what it is. So the C stands for confidence, and then the number is how confident you are you're going to hit that plan. So the C60 plan is the plan that you are 60% sure you are going to hit in the next year. And the reason I love this is the way that you calculate this is by looking at your last 4 months year-over-year growth rate. And then you take the average of that and just assume that that's going to be the growth rate for the rest of the year. Now, admittedly, this is a fairly blunt methodology, but I have done far more complicated versions of this, and I prefer this version. The main reason being is it tends to be more realistic. If you ask someone what their targets are going to be, they tend to overestimate what they can do, whereas this forces you to look at reality and say, well, for the last 4 months, we've been decreasing the traffic. Let's assume that's going to happen unless we do something to really change that. And so you use the last 4 months year-over-year data. This then becomes your sort of default plan that you're going to track against and try to beat. This can be good enough for hiring against and making investment decisions against, and all your team goals should be set against that as well. So as an example, if we were to look at that Macy's section again, sadly, the C60 plan for this section of the website would be minus 56%, because that's what it is down for the average of the last 4 months. You then take that plan and make a more pessimistic plan. So the C90 plan is the plan that you're 90% sure you can hit, even in a bad year, right? So even if there were macro trends, Google updates, things that are out with your control, you're 90% sure that you would still hit this. And the way you do that plan is by taking your C60 plan and just taking an extra 10 to 20% off of those traffic numbers. And that's going to give you a plan which might not be exciting to look at, but you can use it as a very conservative plan for any budgeting and investments. It can be a plan that you're confident in even in turbulent times, but it's definitely going to be a plan that you are anticipating you will beat, right? So this is not what you're aiming for. It is ideally the worst case scenario. And then lastly is my favorite plan, which is the C10 plan. This is the stretch plan that you're going to try and hit. And you do this exactly in the same way. You take your C60 plan and you add 10 to 20% on top of that. Now, this by definition is an unlikely plan, but it should be hard and achievable. And this shouldn't, unlike the C60 plan, you shouldn't use this for any planning and hiring, because by the nature, it's unlikely you will hit this. And you don't want jobs to be in the line, payroll to be in the line because you didn't hit some stretch target. But what I like about this is it gives you multiple options to track against and still be realistic, right? So you can have one eye on that stretch target. This can be particularly motivating, while also having your C60 and C90 plan to track against as well. So once you have that, you can then drag that forward and make your forecast for the rest of the year, and it would look something like this. So you have these 3 levels of traffic that you're trying to hit, and you're going to track against that the rest of the year. Now, the sad thing is, when you're in a situation like the forecast we just showed, sometimes, even if you hit your C10 plan, you're still going to be below your previous year traffic. And that can be a tough pill to swallow, to knock it out of the park and still be down year over year. But that is sometimes what is necessary. As I said in the beginning, it's very unlikely that you're going to recover 40, 50, 60% traffic in a single year. So sometimes you have to make these plans over multiple years to get back that investment. Most of the time, we're not looking at such a pessimistic view. This is what it would look like if you are having, say, a reasonable amount of growth, say 10 to 20%. What you end up with is something that looks like this, where you would have your C90 plan on the bottom. The green line is your previous year's traffic. So in this instance, 2024 traffic. Your C60 plan is a little bit above that, and then your C10 plan is your stretch plan. And most of the time, this is what you'd be looking at unless your website is going through a really tough time. And so hopefully this is a bit more motivating to look at. Now, this does require some art and science. I don't know anything about the situation that Macy's was in for that one sector. There could be a million different reasons, not least that it's third-party data, so it could be completely wrong. But you are going to have to take those numbers and then say, well, do I want to add 10%, 20%, 30% to the C10 plan? Going up and down from the C60 plan, that is where the art comes into it. You might have some good reason to believe that you can grow more than 10 or 20% of the C60 plan, or on the flip side, if you're not getting any more resources on your team, or your budget's just been cut, there's reasons why you might decide to have an even more conservative view of that. So use that as your baseline, as your C60, and then adjust as necessary up and down. Okay. Step 3 is to track against those goals. So once you have those three plans, how do you make sure you're on track? So I've actually given a whole webinar on this process called Drive Performance with these 4 disciplines for SEO teams. It's a whole process of setting good lag metrics, then lead metrics. I recommend going and have a look at that if you're interested. I'm now, for this presentation, just going to focus on the last part of that, which is how do you track against these metrics. So remember that your goal is to put things in place that gives you more chance of hitting the C10 plan than the C90 plan, right? Once you have these, it may or may not be motivating to look at the plans, but you can then decide to say, well, if my C60 plan is only growing 5% this year, what can I do to beat that and get closer to the C10 plan? And you're going to track against it, as you can see here. And obviously this is made up data because it goes into the future. But this scenario, I'm imagining that we are setting targets in the beginning of 2025, and then we're going to track against that every single month to see, are we on the C90, the C60, or the C10 plan? So the first thing you want to do to run this process is change the phrasing of your goals. So make sure that you phrase these goals as go from X to Y by date. So instead of just having a goal like increase your click-through rate or double the number of buying guides, you want to get as specific as possible. You want to say something like, we want to increase our PLP click-through rates from X% to Y% by the 1st of July 2025. Or in the content example, it might be go from 200 to 300 buying guides by September 2025. To flip back to the Macy's example, that might be something like go from 3,400 sessions a month to 4,500. And the colors there are showing you your 2024 numbers to ideally hitting the C10 plan. So once you have that, that is your lag measure. Now, the trouble with lag measures is they lag, right? You don't know until you get there whether or not you've hit it. And so it's not a good plan to only focus on that, because you're essentially looking in a rearview mirror, right? You're not going to know whether you're on track without having something else to measure against. And that's where lead measures come in. Lead measures are essentially bets, right? You're saying, we bet that if we do X, we will achieve that lag metric. And in order to set good lead metrics, there are 2 things I would recommend. One is they should be predictive of achieving the goal. And the second is they have to be influenced by the team. So if you're going to go set metrics and lead metrics for your SEO team, they have to be things which they can influence themselves and are predictive of actually achieving that goal. Now, there's two different ways you can do this. Well, at least two ways you can do it. One is to focus on outcomes, which are essentially mini lag metrics. So the team is accountable for the outcome of this mini lag metric, not necessarily how to achieve it. So an example of that might be, you might set a goal of going from X click-through rate to Y click-through rate, but you're not going to tell the team how they do that, right? You're just going to hold them accountable to the result, the click-through rate percentage. The other type you can do is to focus on the actions themselves. So the team is accountable for doing the thing rather than the result. So that might be you're going to say, all right, we are going to update the content on our product pages, three pages a day, 10 pages a day, whatever that number is, and you're going to measure the team against making sure that they always do that week in, week out. And if that isn't successful, then you change the action, right? You try something else. But the whole point is you're going to track against the action, not the outcome. When you're setting this program up, typically timelines of 3 to 6 months work best, because as I said, on day one, you're not going to be able to hit your numbers because you've not even done the activities that you want to do yet. Those are going to take time to actually influence it. So although I actually showed in the example, month 1, month 2 already having the target set as C60, in real terms, you wouldn't actually set a plan like that because it's going to take you time to get up and running and then see the impact of that on your lag measure. So you have two options. You can either just acknowledge that and communicate it internally that although you're starting the level at that, you're not really expecting to hit it. Or you can actually just lower that and have sort of a phased approach into those targets and start off at a lower level. It's completely up to you. So once you have that, you can then start to piece all of this together. So you have, for instance, a target like this one. You want to go from 20% year-over-year decline to break even by the end of 2025. You're then going to set two lead metrics. I've just made up 2 examples here. It might be something like refreshing your buying guide, 50 buying guides by 1st of September. So that is an outcome focused one. And the second one would be to launch 5 buying guide SEO tests every single month. And that is more of an action-based lead metric. So purple one is the lag, pink ones are the lead metrics. And we've made sure to sort of go through this mini checklist of it's phrased as going from X to Y by date. We're confident that these lead metrics can be influenced by the team, right? The team can edit the content, they can publish the content, and they are predictive of success. Now, there will always be an element of a bet here. Like, we're taking a chance that these are predictive of success of the lag metric. However, as I mentioned earlier, if that turns out not to be true, if you're tracking against your lead metrics and you're not seeing the lag move at all, it may be time to change your lead metrics and try again. And then you're going to measure that week by week and month by month. So these are, as I said, just 2 made up examples. On the left, we have buying guides that are being updated. And again, this goes into the end of 2025. So this is a made up example. But in this example, this retailer manages to sort of maintain the target initially, falls a little bit behind, then it catches up again, and so on. On the experiment side, they have a goal of launching 5 SEO tests every single month, and they've consistently hit that so far. Every single month, they've launched five tests. You're then going to monitor your lag metric and see if that is working. So this is the chart from earlier on, and we can see that month 1, month 2, we're somewhere between the previous year's traffic and the C60 plan, and then eventually by April, it's getting up between C60 and C10. So that's shown great progress, and that would be a leading indicator that the lead metrics are actually working and they are predictive of success in the lag metric. If, as I said, if that wasn't true, if this wasn't been impacted by 2-3 months in, you would probably want to start looking at a different hypothesis to figure out, are these lead metrics really predictive of moving the lag metric? And so then you can just put this all together. And so for marketing managers, marketing directors, this is all you need to look at. You need to look at the lead metrics. Are we doing the things that we said we're going to do? Are we executing on that plan? And is that having the intended effect on the lag metric? And you review this week by week, month by month, and track against it. And if you do that well, this really is all you need to focus on your program and to know whether or not it's working. So to summarize, we have the benchmarking step in the beginning, where you're going to look at your primary data and check how you're doing in those individual categories. You're going to look at your horizontal and vertical competitors and make sure you are looking at appropriate comparisons and appropriate competitors. You're going to take that data and set up your targets using the C60, C90 and C10 process. And then you're going to piece all that together and make sure you're tracking against your lead metrics to make sure that you can influence the lag metric. So that's pretty much it. We're going to go to questions in a second, but before I do that, I just want to remind you of this offer. If you want to book that in, click any of the links here or follow up with me afterwards, and we can set up a quick call. And yeah, like I said, this is if nothing else, you'll get a ton of value from this process, because myself or Will will come in and run through a bunch of actionable things that you can do to get your testing program up and running and sort of benchmark where you are against that maturity curve. So that is it. We have time for questions now. So feel free to drop them into the chat, and I will just have a quick look through the chat and see what we have. Right. A couple of people have asked whether or not the slides are going to be shared. Yes, they will be. Tomorrow we'll be sending out that the recording. Let's see. So someone asked, how would you take seasonality into account for this plan if you're only using 4 months? Do you pick your best or your worst performing 4 months over that period? Great question. The answer is you pick the last 4. And so I did mention that there is a bit of art and science to this. The reason we say that is it tends to be more realistic. There may be reasons that you have big dips that you're aware of. I don't particularly think the one that I shared was, December was even in that for Macy's, right? So there was a Christmas period there. However, it really forces you to stare it in the face and say, is there a reason that I'm going to beat that? Or is that a more realistic trend of where we're going? So you can adjust it, but I would strongly recommend that you don't, unless you really have a good reason to pick a different period. But you then just start getting into, cherry picking. Seasonality should be taken into account to a certain extent, because you're picking, you're looking at that year over year period. But yeah, I would recommend you stick with the 4 months. Someone has asked, how do you manage to get leadership to buy in to invest more in SEO? So for retailers, it tends to be, I wouldn't say easy, but it is easier than certain other markets, because it's so close to revenue. And we've spoken before on other webinars about step one, and again, Will and I talk about this when we run these sessions with teams. Step one is you really have to understand, where are you on the measurement maturity curve? Can you connect traffic to dollars? if you can, it's relatively easy to make a business case for why you should be investing more in certain areas, because you can say, if we do X, we'll get back Y dollars. I'm also slightly biased. Obviously, SearchPilot makes this even easier because we run experiments and we can put a dollar amount with 95% significance next to a change, right? We can run an experiment and say, we've done this, we know that it's going to increase traffic by between 10 to 15%. And if you can connect that to revenue, you can put a price against that and get the budget for it. So obviously not everyone has a testing program like SearchPilot, but in retail, it tends to be a bit easier if you are far along that maturity curve. If you're not, then step one is try and get further along with your analytics to make sure you can connect traffic to revenue. Someone has asked, this is a very test specific one, but what is the baseline traffic per day, per week, per month for running tests? So typically I would say around 30,000 sessions per month. So you need 15,000 to the control, 15,000 to the variant, but it really depends on the number of pages you have. If your website just has that, I would say, you're going to struggle to run a lot of tests. You might only be able to do one test a month. So yeah, typically SEO testing works best for very large templated websites with thousands of pages and millions of sessions and organic traffic. Any other ones? Let's just have a look. Feel free just to drop them in the chat. Someone has messaged asking, how do you select good lead metrics? So it is a bit of a leap of faith. You need to, other than those two things that I mentioned, like predictive of moving the lag metric and making sure that it is in the control of the team. There is no perfect answer. I think the slightly longer version is to make sure you iterate quickly, right? So pick lead measures. You're never going to get it perfect. You are placing educated bets. But then if you're tracking that lead metric week by week, and I do recommend tracking lead metrics by week, not by month, then hopefully you're going to quickly see whether or not it's having the intended effect. So yeah, that's my recommendation there. Someone else has asked, how do you integrate your SEO testing with user testing? And the short answer is you have to work with your product teams. So most retail companies have a user testing team already in place using something like Unoptimizely, Adobe Target, etc. Those tools all just measure the impact on users. They don't tell you the impact on SEO. And so when we work with companies to integrate SEO testing, we have to work with that team to get a shared understanding of what are the tests on their side that could be impacting SEO, and other tests on the organic side that you want to try, which could be impacting users as well. And so you end up with a bit of a shared roadmap. And then we use another framework called RACI. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but that's RACI, and it stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. And so the idea is, depending on what the type of change you're going to make, there will be different stakeholders that need to be either responsible for that, consulted, responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed. So an example might be, you might decide amongst the two teams that anything which is just metadata, because that is not visible to users, the SEO team can run those tests on their own without sign off from product teams. On the flip side, if you're going to run a test which impacts your users, then you're going to have to at least consult the the product team, and more often than not, they will usually be accountable for that, and they will have the final sign off. So communication, as with a lot of these things, is the answer. But yeah, it's something that we do a lot. I think that's it. I'm not sure we have any other test questions or anything on target. So I think we can wrap up at that. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to drop me a line on craig.bradford@searchpilot.com, and I'll be happy to answer them. And yeah, like I said, you'll all get the recording some point tomorrow. Thank you all for attending, and apologies once again for the late start. Hopefully you all found it useful. Thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.